Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. And let me begin by thanking all of you who send us emails and letters and let us know that this program is an encouragement to you. Thank you for that. That's an encouragement to us. It's good to know who's out there on the other side of the camera. And also thank you for your prayers and support of EWTN, because that makes this program possible. They give me the privilege of joining you to hear stories of men and women on their journey. How the Holy Spirit opened their heart to a deeper walk with Jesus Christ and His church. Our guest tonight is someone very close to me, and he's been on the program once before, but I think this is only the second time. My son, JonMarc, is going to join us on the program tonight. For a couple reasons, I invited him back. One, this is being broadcast on the day after Father's Day, so here we are, two fathers. A grandfather, father of my grandchildren, of course I'm father, and JonMarc once discerned whether you were called to be a priest as a father. So those are all issues in his journey. But also I wanted to have him back because JonMarc is now the director of the Coming Home Network underneath me. And so he's the one that's kind of running things, and I wanted us to take a chance. We don't often do this as much in detail on the Journey Home program, but to talk a little bit about the mission of what we do. This isn't an infomercial about the Coming Home Network, but it correlates with the conversions and the people that we're interviewing here on the Journey Home program, asking questions about young people being drawn to the church. What are the barriers that stand in the way of people? What about young people who leave the church? Why do they do that? These are all some questions that, JonMarc, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thanks, Dad. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back, but it's wonderful to have you join on the program. I think we were wondering, what do we put under your name, lifelong Catholic? But no, you were baptized. Were you baptized by me? I can't remember. My memory's getting bad. I think or Reverend Stratman, who was so near to us. But you were baptized as a Protestant long before you came into the church. Right. So let me get out of the way and invite you to give us a short summary of your journey, if you would.
Yeah, well, that first 6 years of my life or so, before we were Catholic, you probably remember much more of that than I do. But I do have little flashes here and there of the sounds and the sights and some of the people and a lot of the music, the songs, and so I do remember that transition a little bit. But both from that beginnings in the Presbyterian church that we were in, as well as then moving into the Catholic Church, I had a wonderful childhood in that regard. We had a lot. We were surrounded by Christ in the people and in our family.
Yeah. Although I've got to interject here for the audience, that only in the sense that your mother and I were always concerned about the problem of PKs, pastors' kids, because doesn't matter what a pastor would do. It's always an environment for the young person being brought up in the church, the good and the bad, of dad's up in front, family trying to live out what they preach at home, So we were always concerned about that with you.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I experienced, some of the problems that are associated with the stereotypical PK or pastor's kid. I mean, I think I experienced all the benefits of joining the church, later on in one's life, but none of the struggles. So as you guys were coming in, we were all learning a lot about the Catholic faith. We were meeting new people. We were, around Steubenville and Franciscan University and meeting a lot of those contacts. And so, I grew up very excited about the faith and very excited about the different things that you were involved in, and I really loved, I've spent most of my life around conversion, around talking to people, even from my earliest days. We were going to conferences and meeting people and hearing their stories. And I grew up loving the faith, loving everything about Catholicism, in the big sense. All the sights and sounds and smells, all the books, all the literature. I really loved it. And one thing I know, even from my earliest days, the faith of the people that I'd grown up around, and your faith and Mom's faith really impacted me. The sincerity of it, and it was an important thing to me. I grew up loving the things that you guys loved. I don't know if we talked about this more later. Now that I have my own kids, I'm seeing the importance of this, that I grew up enjoying things with you. I mean, we listened, you introduced me to music, and we would read, the Lord of the Rings and Narnia and things like that. And so a lot of the things that I learned to love because you guys did. And I'm seeing now that in my own children, the importance of doing things with them and enjoying things with them, and especially the faith, getting into prayer and scripture together, not as something that I'm putting on them or trying to get them to do, but something that we're living out and enjoying together. So that, I think that's probably one of the most striking parts of my childhood, was that, the impression that left on me. So going forward into my early teen years, I have lots of information coming in about this faith that I'm learning about, and I was struggling a little bit to sort of put it together into a coherent whole of what it meant for me to grow in my faith. There was lots of it. I remember early in my teen years going to lots of youth conferences and things like that, with friends and family, and going there and experiencing a lot of the emotional high, a lot of good experiences, but then coming back and trying to figure out how to integrate that into my understanding of what this journey, what this process was looking like going forward. And I remember being a little confused about, I wanted this close relationship with Christ, and I wondered, I go to these conferences and I have these experiences. Is that what that is? When I'm searching for, this closeness, this intimacy with Christ, I know maybe I have a little of it, but I want more of it. Is that what it is? Or is there something more than that? And I was trying to wrestle with that. I'd say, throughout this time, I took it for granted that God was real. It never occurred to me to really worry about that or question that, and that Christ was real. I think from the upbringing, I wouldn't have considered probably any other faith. It was either Catholicism or nothing for me, just because I grew up kind of seeing, from the stories and a lot of the things that the work that you were involved in, of how the... Go ahead.
Well, I was wondering, at homeschool, we did that, and it wasn't because we totally rejected public school or Catholic schools. It was because of where we kept moving, and it was the most convenient, and your mother and I both were educated to be able to do that. However, homeschool, evangelical Protestantism, very conservative Catholicism, charismatic Catholicism in the environment, so with all those friends and family and conferences. And I know then what you were encountering was, okay, I have all this information, I see models of that, but is it real for me, and how does it get deeper? And I was wondering, was it the fact that as you were getting older, now all of a sudden you're encountering other voices, also challenging? Was that also a part of it? And as you got out of the homeschool and out of the family, one of the things is you wanted to wrestle and play football, so now you're going to regular school for a couple of years.
Yeah, so that was the next steps. Later on, sort of mid-teen years, I did, we had talked about it, and we decided I was going to go to high school for a few years. I personally wanted to kind of know how I measured up, was I was I knowing my stuff? And I was, but it was also for the sports and stuff like that. So at that point, there started to be some more voices. And also, at that point, I was dealing more with, sort of the habitual sins of teens. I was wrestling with a lot of those types of things. And so, I was kind of going back and forth with confession and different things, and realizing that this spiritual life was a little tougher than maybe I imagined it would be. But I wouldn't say that the influences were much there. It was sort of, then as I looked more toward college, a lot of things were going on at one time. I was wrestling with a lot of personal sins at that time. And I was in discernment, because I kept having this, well, I'll talk more about that in a second, but then at that point I was reading more and going out a little bit further and beginning to think a bit more outside some of these bigger questions. The discernment was funny because, again, I never really had a rebellious phase. I grew up loving this stuff, and so in terms of my discernment of my vocation, I had sort of this sense that I think a lot of young people in the church have, which is that if I'm really serious about this, then I'm probably called to be a priest, even though I really didn't want to be. I kind of dreaded that possibility, but you get this idea in your mind that that's the way the universe works, and that's the way God is. That if you're dreading it, it's probably the thing that you're going to be called to do. So, but I was open to it, and I was trying to be open, but that was causing me a lot of sort of existential angst a little bit, figuring out what am I called to do. So that was a big thing going on in those mid-teen years. And then, yes, as I looked toward college and toward some of these questions, I realized that this faith that I really loved, and whose members, the best examples of which I was so impressed by, I had never really studied or looked at from the outside. And in some sense, we were talking about this the other day, and I was trying to think about how to characterize it. And I realized to some degree, the little bit of turbulence that I went through in my later teen years, you sort of set me up for, because I grew up really admiring your and Mom's faith in Christ. It was something that was very, very strong and sincere. I remember as I first became a teen, and I was getting anxious and depressed about different things. I would listen to some of your old tapes telling your testimony, because how much you'd given up and how seriously you'd taken the questions of truth and authority. That meant so much to me. Mm-hmm. And even as I began to question the bigger picture of the faith a little bit, that meant a lot. That meant that that inspired me to, I have to figure this out, because it's either a belief in something that's very, very, very not real, or it is, or something very real. So, but then, the reason that set me up a little bit is that then you do get mixed examples within the church. It's a big church, and it's a hospital for sinners,
within the family. I mean, yeah, of course.
So I had the examples of your guys' faith and these saints that I'd read about, and this idea of a personal, intimate relationship with Christ. I got Catholicism in the big sense, and I really loved it and would prefer it to be true. But I really wondered, what the church was proposing as a possibility for me in terms of faith. What was this faith that the church was offering us? Certainly some people seem to have this lively, close, intimate faith with Christ, but then the vast majority just don't. They don't seem like they know him. They like the system, yeah. They like the service, they like the different stuff, but you don't ever hear them talking about Jesus. And in some sense, in some circles, when you hear faith talked about, there's a variety of different sort of shades that you start to hear about it. Some people, the way they talk, it's like the sort of what they think faith is that, we believe in this now because it's expedient and because we like it and because it makes life a little better. But will we know it's true until we die? No. And that's, you hear some people say that, or in the first philosophy class I took, as we were debating the existence of God, an evangelical, I think she was an evangelical girl, gets up and said, well, the way that I know that God exists is that I have faith. And what does that mean? Especially since we're trying to, we're talking first about outside that question of how do you even know that there's something in the first place? So what does faith really mean? And that became sort of the main crux of my question for a number of years as I proceeded into first seminary very briefly as I was discerning, and then on into college. It really became this crux of, I wanted to know what did the church really, how did it characterize faith? This faith that I was supposed to have in Christ. What did it mean? And what was it supposed to look like?
And I was going to jump into there and said, you and I both know people, even relatives, family members, that their understanding of faith is, well, there's a list of things.
Yeah.
And okay, I accept those.
Right.
But it doesn't affect their life any, or
right.
They don't go to church, or, I'm a Christian, yeah, well, I accept these things. And of course, that list is getting shorter and shorter all the time because there's so many conflicting voices out there in our culture. Well, okay, I don't have to worry about the church, and sacraments are important, but, oh yeah, that guy Jesus, yeah, I accept him, I'm a Christian. I mean, so faith is just accepting a bunch of stuff.
Right. And that's what I needed to find out. As you see these different examples within the church, the larger church, the question is, are those people who seem to have this more mystical faith, this closer, intimate relationship with Christ, are those the exceptions? Are those just the fans, the crazy, are they just a little bit too excited about this? And are the rest of the Catholics and Christians who just sort of believe the items, but they don't really know, is that what faith is? And so I realized at the point, I didn't really know what the church said about this. Because it's so easy just to talk about faith and never really think about how are people receiving this. And so many people would talk about faith, but never would be addressing these questions that were in my mind, and imagine a lot of the minds of my friends and companions at that point. So I did at that, around that time, even though I was sort of wrestling with this stuff, I had been on track to try out seminary and to discern a little bit, and so I was there. And in seminary, I had at the Josephinum in Columbus. I took a class on the first part of the Catechism, which ended up being, a very important class for me, because I'd read some bits here and there from the Catechism, but I'd never read much of it, and I'd certainly never read it sort of from the outside. I'd gone through lots of Catholic stuff from the inside, just assuming it's true, especially since we'd been, spent my life around converts and talking about, but really looking at it slightly from the outside and saying, what does this, is this coherent? What does it tell me about the world? What does it tell me about myself?
All right, I just want to, for the audience that's listening on radio, the guest is my son, JonMarc Grodi. This kind of connects with just what you're saying in terms of the PK problem, and that is many PKs just kind of assume they know it all. Almost like they absorbed it in the process. So there's a catechism sitting there. It's almost like, do I need to read that? I kind of know it all. And I wonder if that was a little bit, because you had heard it so many times that there was no motivation to read the catechism. And I wonder if a lot of people have catechisms sitting on their shelves. And I've been a Catholic all my life. I know that stuff. Yeah. But they don't take the time.
Yeah. And it's the way that you approach it too. I think at some point everyone has to approach the faith, just as everyone has to approach Christ as someone sort of new. Like we all have to have the experience of, people telling us come and see Christ, and us not just assuming we already know him, but really kind of approaching him in a new way, almost as for the first time.
Is that why C.S. Lewis did Aslan?
Maybe, I don't know.
To see Christ from through new lenses.
I think so. It's funny that my son, who's 4 now, we're working. We just got through the Dawn Treader, and at the end of the Dawn Treader, Aslan says, I have a different name in your world. And so I've letting him stew on that for a few weeks, and he finally figured out the other day during Mass. He was like, Dad, I think Aslan is Jesus. So, and I guess another literary reference, I love G.K. Chesterton's, the image he uses in a lot of his works of the man who sort of sets out from England on a rowboat to discover a new land, and then finds a shore and gets out and sees this sort of magical new land that he's never seen before, and then realizes, of course, that it's just England, that he's just seeing through new eyes. And I think that's an important thing that everyone has to go through, for their important things of their life. They have to, and that's, I think, one of the points of pilgrimage. You kind of go away to seek God and come back to see things new. So there's different ways that happens, but it's, I think, an important process that everyone has to find out somehow. So in digging into the first part of the Catechism, it was that experience a little bit of, okay, finally, this is good. I'm going to kind of study this from the outside just a little bit, and what does it look like from a whole? Does it hold together? And it also addressed the more specific question of what does the Church say about faith? What is it? Because if you get in the beginning of the Catechism, if you have any questions about what the Church says about faith, or how God comes to meet man, how man comes to know God, it's right there at the very beginning. That's, I think a lot of young people these days would be surprised at how candid the Church is on these issues. There's always this suspicion that, well, maybe the Church, maybe the priests, maybe the scholars of the Church haven't ever really thought about these difficult issues. Well, that's, of course, it's a very silly thought, and you find that to be so as soon as you dig into it. So one of the things the Catechism says about faith is that faith is man's response to God. And as I read through those sections and how the Church characterizes it, it's very clear that, and also elsewhere in the Catechism where it talks about faith, hope, and love as being theological virtues, it became very clear that, to my delight, what I was hoping for, that the Church faith is not something that I can do on my own. I can't choose to believe something I don't believe. I can't, make myself have a relationship with either existent or non-existent entity. It's not something that I do. If it's real at all, it's something that Christ does. He came to meet us in the flesh 2,000 years ago, but that didn't end. That wasn't just for those people. Through the Church, through the sacraments, through the Bible, through the witness of other people, and through prayer, our own wrestling in this internal life, He does come to meet us. And faith is man's response to something that God has done and is doing. And that's what I wanted to hear. I don't think, every religious experience or everything up to that point had been false, had been wrong. I think I had, experienced Christ in certain ways. But I really needed to know that wasn't all there was. you know, that this growing in intimacy was something that was going to be more and more higher up and further in, if you will. And that's what the church was proposing to me. And so that opened, you know, that sort of put me on level ground again. Okay, I can test this out. I can pursue this and expect that. Well, I can test out the hypothesis. This is what the church proposes as a possibility to me, and so I can seek God in these ways. So, I mean, putting that aside for a second, I did discern that I didn't think I was, at least at that point, I wasn't being called to be a priest. And part of that, you know, was that I was around these guys, again, more good examples of faith, these guys who really did think that they had a call. You know, they didn't necessarily all want or you know, or feel ready for it, but they definitely felt like the call, this language of the call to the priesthood, wasn't just a cliche. It wasn't just sort of empty language. It was something real. You know, they did feel a call, and I could imagine myself feeling a call, but I didn't at that point. You know, and all the data I had was what I wanted to go on. I had things I wanted to study. I wanted to get married and be a father, and so yeah. Pending a future call, I decided I didn't need to continue in seminary.
Well, I remember that night I went out to McDonald's, and you know, after the first semester, and that when you told me all this, but you did have a call. You had a call to be a father. You know, here we are at Father's Day, but you knew that was your call. And of course, I've seen it affirmed many times now, and in lots of different ways. Right. So you were discerning your call.
Yeah. Yeah, so I headed off from there. I spent a semester at the University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne. And then through a bunch of circumstances, I can't remember all of them, somehow I ended up back in Bowling Green. I think we were trying to find a place closer and a little cheaper and near to... You were going to live with your grandmother.
Yeah.
So I ended up at Bowling Green State University in northwestern Ohio. And they have a great Newman program there, or a Newman House, whatever, and campus ministry and all that. So I met a lot of good friends there, good priests. And at that point, I think I'd been doing English and a little bit of like theater and that sort of stuff. And I started that at Bowling Green, but I can't remember how I got on that track. I think it's just because of all these questions and realizing that not only did these answer what I sort of felt this need to explore, but also because it was enjoyable and interesting. I decided to switch to English and philosophy, with philosophy being my main focus, and so that set the course, you know, for the rest of my college studies. And so that's where I had that philosophy 101 class. The person stood up, and you know, I had a lot of interesting experiences through that. I mean, initially, when you get into science or philosophy, as they quip, you know, the first draft makes you an atheist. It didn't make me an atheist, but it didn't also necessarily clear things up really quickly. I mean, there were some tough questions. One of the first classes, I probably shouldn't have taken this so early in my philosophy, but I took a class on the mind, you know, and of course it was all the modern theories about trying to figure out, you know, what the relationship between the mind and the brain and all this sort of stuff. And there's a lot of questioning of free will, you know, and it's easy for those involved to talk a very big game about it, you know, as if much has been discovered to it. But the more you dig into it, very little of what we experience can possibly be explained in science. It's useful stuff. It's very interesting. But the philosophy of the mind has a much deeper, wider tradition than, of course, its modern dabblers give it credit for. So. So it was a tough experience at the beginning, but it got better and better, and I didn't realize it at the time, but what I grew up, my love for literature, for English, I realized over time that played right into philosophy, because that's really where when you learn to use and to love language, that's where you learn to do philosophy, to do the thought, you know, to be able to observe and describe and communicate with others about the universe and to ask the right questions. You have to have the language to do that, to form those questions and to express them and to discuss them. So there was this natural synergy between my first love, which was sort of literature and the arts, and then now my new academic direction, which was philosophy. So I had a lot of great classes with that. And at the same time, I was enjoying this new community that I was discovering, and I lived for a time, you know, intentionally in a men's household, a Catholic men's household there, and it's right on the grounds or in the little complex attached to the university parish. And so I was also able to then spend some good time in fraternity and community with these guys, but also I was very close to the chapel. And so I was still working through these questions of what faith meant, and I was learning more about the Catechism, and I was finding, again, more and more, at least on the intellectual level, that first of all, just as I had always hoped and hoped and expected, the Church, Catholicism not only holds together, Christianity, but it's also the best explanation for these different questions. Now, I love, one of my absolute favorite books is G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. And one of the things he does in there is he shows how, these questions are what we sort of desire out of the world, or the different sort of passions that humans try to wrestle with. Christianity is the only system that is able to take those and balance them and answer sort of the opposing difficulties of life. As an example, we have to, as Christians, we love the world as something that God has created and given to us, but we also, to a certain degree, we remain detached and we hate the world. We see, it's a fallen world and it has problems, and so there's this tension, and different systems, more pessimistic or more optimistic systems, take one and run with it. But it's only in Christianity that you find a reason and a rationale for the balance that really fulfills a human. And that's really what I discovered more and more, that on all these levels, all these things that humans want, and all put together, as Chesterton calls it, the romance, that's only ultimately found in Christianity. So I was finding that more and more confirmed, in my English language studies, as well as the more I got into philosophy, the more I studied the Catechism. But at the same time, again, so the important thing for me now that I had this proposed to me, what it could be, now I was seeking this more interior life. It wasn't completely new, but I was approaching God in a new. I want this sort of relationship, and the most important thing to me became Eucharistic adoration. Because again, what the Church proposes to us is that Christ didn't just come 2,000 years ago for those people back then, but that through the sacraments, in a particular way, He remains present to us, that we can approach Him. So, spending lots of time in quiet, and in prayer, asking God and seeking and listening. I would say that intellectually, again, I identify with Chesterton's description of his own journey, in that lots of little things confirmed throughout my life, confirming that. And then just this experience of, over time in prayer, experiencing more and more the presence of God.
In that fine Catholic community there at Bowling Green. What a great place God had called you unexpectedly. Right. Wonderful. We'll pause there, JonMarc, and we'll come back after the break and pick up on how you grew in leadership there in that community, and of course you met Teresa and all of that, and then we'll talk about your journey now in apostolate life as you seek to serve the Lord and live out your gifts. So we'll come back in a bit. Thank you. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and my guest tonight is my son, JonMarc, my oldest son, JonMarc. Of course, it's also Peter and Richard, but just a note to mention that you might see JonMarc occasionally. He's going to fill in for me as a guest host occasionally in the future on The Journey Home, so you might see his face come back a couple times. I'll give you a little more time to summarize your journey, and then we've got a few questions I'd like to throw your way.
Sounds good. Yeah, so again, that time, slowly, it's not always the case, journeys happen in different ways, but slowly over time, the intellectual journey, and then, sort of the interior journey of, especially encountering Christ in prayer and in the presence of the Holy Eucharist. In the Eucharist, it was an important thing for me, and those slowly over time really came together, and And so over the course of that experience. And so I also, I began to get involved with the campus outreach, with the community there. I was the president of our Catholic student life group for 1 year there. I met my wife, or my wife to be, Teresa, through the group, and we did a lot of ministry together and began to date. And it was just a great experience overall. It was a great community. An example of something that we brought in some speakers on theology of the body, and that was something that was big in the community there at that time. And it was timely, both for my wife and I in different ways, but one of the ways that it was good for me, it was this example of this sort of applied theology, or this theology, that gave the modern man and woman a much better it was so much more of a satisfying theory about this data that we have, our experiences, our bodies, our differences, the different things we experience in relationship to our sexuality. We have what the world gives us and various, things it tells us about those. But in terms of a rich and satisfying explanation that doesn't just explain why we're here and where we came from in terms of our sexuality, but what we're supposed to do with it, and how it's something that God has given to us, for certain purposes. I and my friends, experienced that as a powerful idea. The ideas of theology of the body. But we also it was neat to see on a secular campus how that was such a refreshing thing for so many of our fellow students. We filled the gymnasiums many times with all sorts of students, certainly not just from our small little Catholic group, to come hear a Catholic speaker talk about sex and sexuality, and about John Paul II's theology of the body. And again, it was such an intriguing alternative to what the world tells them about their bodies and about their destinies. That humans, that we have a nature, that certain things fulfill us and other things don't. It's one of these areas, again, with my philosophy at that time, I was realizing that there's so many of these seemingly practical issues where the modern person thinks they can just sort of opt out of the big questions, opt out of the philosophy, and just, I'm just a practical person. I don't worry about those ethics or the morals or the philosophy. I'm a practical person. But these questions of what how you live your life on a day-to-day basis, the decisions you make are based in these philosophies. The modern mind has accepted that the humans have no nature. We are whatever we make ourselves to be. We can adapt to any scenario, any sexual revolution, any technological revolution. But the alternative is to say, well, no. But if humans do have a nature, if we are a certain thing and not some other sort of thing, then there's always going to be certain things that fulfill us. And so again, a lot of these things were coming together at this time, and and so that whole experience of that community, that campus outreach, was very good, and it confirmed and sort of wrapped up a lot of the questions that I had. So I graduated in 2010, and Teresa and I were married. And I'd been working off and on over the years for the Coming Home Network, your apostolate, in different capacities. And so I started working again, doing website stuff, and working on how we were telling the world about some of that work and some of these stories. Teresa and I now, we're 5 years. Oh goodness, I have to check my math when I get home. We have 3 children: Dominic, who's 4, Lucy, who is 2, and Cecilia, who's almost 1.
I think this will be your 6th year, because John's turning 5, right? And
I think that's right.
Lucy's turning 3, and Cecilia will be 1. So
there we go.
Right. Meryl and I will be our 30th. So that's right. The work we do in the Coming Home Network, which I talk about often here, is at the core is sharing the beauty of the Catholic faith, specifically with non-Catholic baptized Christians. That's our goal, is to help our separated brethren, our brothers and sisters, discover the fullness of the faith. And you had mentioned earlier in your journey how that one of the awakenings to you was recognizing that faith is about responding to what God's already done by grace in our life. That's the core.
Right.
And I'm so proud of your work with us. You're not just doing it because your dad did it, but this is you. This is your conversion. Talk about that very idea and how it shapes our outreach, a Catholic outreach to non-Catholic Christians. Yeah. Why is it that when you believe that we're responding to what God has already done, that's the motivation to evangelization?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, part of it, I'll say to begin with, is that I never, for a long time, I didn't see this work, you know, the work of sort of interdenominational stuff, the questions of, you know, Catholicism versus any other sort of Christianity weren't as important to me, because my questions were bigger. You know, it was either Catholicism or nothing to some degree. But, you know, at the core of that, the reason why it was such, why I was so intent on figuring that out was precisely because of the witness that I'd seen before and after becoming Catholic, the witness of people who loved Jesus. You know, that may have been most of the content of the faith. They may have not had the rest, but they had that core, that kernel, that they believed and they knew and they loved and they were in communion with Christ. And so, you know, over time, as I was seeking the reasons for that joy, you know, that I wanted to make sure that was real and true and possible. And so as I found that in my own heart, my own life, I turned back and realized that. So then, sharing all the rest that I now could be secure in the rest of the Christian life, the Christian faith, the historical Christian faith in Catholicism, all its riches, to be able to share that with those sorts of people out there, people who knew Christ but didn't necessarily have the rest of what He wanted to give them in the sacraments, in the sure foundation of the authority that He gave His apostles to guide the church, you know, by cooperating with the Holy Spirit. There's so much more there. But again, what it comes down to is that it was those relationships with Christ that most moved me. And so now, you know, in the Coming Home Network, that's what we're so excited about, that we see that there's these people out there who, with the light that they've been given, with what they've been taught, they have come to approach Christ and to know Him in prayer, and they love Him. And we just want to share the rest that he wants to give them in the church. So again, it's something that He's done, I guess, in terms of the action of God too. It's grace as well, that the grace that wherever a person starts, you know, He's working in grace for them to take the next step. And so if someone's following Christ with their whole heart, in whatever tradition they've been brought up in, I mean, even setting aside the truth of, you know, the truth of Catholicism for a second, for all of us, there are next steps that He wants us to take, because none of us are done or finished. You know, He has next steps that He wants to draw us closer to Himself. And what we just want to propose is that for many people, you know, some of those next steps are the treasures that He wants to give you through the church, particularly in His body and blood in the Eucharist.
Yeah, one of the differences between our evangelical background, you were there as a young man, and it was a big part of my life, for most of my life, was this idea that when you everything you believe is a gift of grace. Even the idea that I'm open to God, that is evidence that God has nudged you.
Right.
As a Calvinist, I took that more definitively as I didn't have freedom to respond. It was just God's decision, because I emphasize His sovereignty. But as a Catholic, I recognize the beauty of this both and. Yeah. That we have total freedom to respond to that nudge of grace. But it was a nudge of grace. It was God first. Right. I love because He first loved us, John says in 1 John.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the aspects, again, as I began to get into philosophy, that was one of the aspects of Catholicism as a system of thought that makes it so satisfying for someone who's asking those questions, because the kind of universe that we live in, as we, you know, the more you explore it, you realize that because it is so complex, because it is, again, with Hamlet, we say there's so much more in heaven and earth than you've dreamt of in all your philosophy. You know, if you're really honest and humble in your exploration of the universe, you realize it's always more. Whenever you go exploring, you always find so much more. There's always so much more. It's not the opposite of, well, what you think you found is always less. You know, love is lust, reason is rationalization, and all that. And so with that in mind, with this moreness, this quality of the universe, That's the kind of thing we would expect, where sometimes there are things that seem to be in opposition or in contradiction, but they're just not. That's just the way the universe is. So God's sovereignty, the more that you explore philosophically what a God must mean philosophically, him having a plan and providence and sovereignty has to be the case somehow. But also, he came and told us that we can choose, that we have free will to respond to his grace. So we can't quite comprehend exactly how those work together, but we know that they must. And again, the key is both that we should expect, with the kind of universe we're in, we should expect those kind of complexities that we might discover, and we have to sort of figure out how they just do work. But also living those things out, that's where you find this crucial, fulfilling peace for a human being. Humans who have lived, we see this historically as well as literarily, humans who live with this sense that there is a plan, there's a providence, that someone really has this all figured out, but also that I have to choose and I have to strive. Those are the ones that find they find purpose, and they move forward, and they do great things. So,
well, one of the beauties that I discovered, which is parallel to what you're talking about, is so this place of Catholicism, this philosophy, this theology of Catholicism, is where these big questions come together.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean they come together in a way that we understand them.
Right.
It comes together to recognize we need humility.
Yeah.
It drives us humility. I mean, think about this. Understanding God is totally sovereign. Calvin had it right there.
Mm-hmm.
Totally sovereign, all-knowing, unchanging. But he didn't just create virtues to force them on us. Virtues are an expression of his character.
Right.
So at the same time he's all this, he's also the humblest, most merciful, most loving being in the universe.
Right.
So how can it be unchanging, yet merciful, loving, a God who's humble?
Right.
How do you put those together?
Yeah. Yeah, it's only in Catholicism that you'll find a recognition of. I mean, there are certain things we can figure out. I mean, the church has always been a huge proponent of science. There are certain things we can work out. Science and philosophy, we can figure out a lot of these questions, a lot of these truths. But then there are certain places where our reason, it just can't quite go beyond there. There are things that are far beyond that. And through revelation, God has given us some of those pieces. He's told us who he is through Christ. He's told us certain things about ourselves that go beyond what we could ever figure out. And so, it's in Catholicism that you have this meeting between reason, all the best that reason can bring, but also this faith in a God who has revealed certain things to himself. That's where those come together, more than anywhere else.
Talk about young people today, people your age, where they're at. How do we reach them? And where are even our non-Catholic Christian brothers and sisters your age, with the voices in their lives? How do we help them discover the beauty and fullness of Christ in his church? Yeah.
Well, the first thing I would say, again, I even though I went through my time of questioning and doubt, in the end, I think it was a success story as far as parenting goes. Because I grew up loving good, true, and beautiful things, and so however far I questioned, I was intent on really finding the truth, not just rebelling, not just tearing down, not just finding an easy alternative. No, I wanted to find truth, and I wanted to find the basis for this goodness and beauty that I had touched in literature and in the examples of people. I wanted to find that. So some of the most important thing that parents can give their children, I think, are that enjoying things with them, teaching them to love, and showing them the things, the good and true and beautiful things they should love. Listen to good music with them, read them good books and with them, and obviously teach them the faith, but show them the example. So that's the first thing. And then I'd say that the other thing that I experienced a lot is that when I was encountering these questions, that I know youth, other young men and women are experiencing similar questions. It's very easy within the church, within the faith, to talk about it outside of the context that we're actually in. The place in history we are, the place we are culturally, we have to recognize that certain words, like certain words and concepts, we can't just pass them on and assume they're going to be understood and received the way they ought to be because of what they are. My example was faith. That was a word that just, it's used tirelessly, or belief. You think about the way that word is used and abused. Every Disney movie has something about, believing in yourself, or believe and you can do anything, or so it's a word that's used in a variety of contexts. And so we have to be careful when we're teaching our kids what it means to have faith, that we're presenting the reality there, and also in recognizing that there's a lot of verbal baggage that comes along with a lot of these things. And we need to make sure that we don't neglect the core there of what
Here's an email that touches a little bit on what you're talking about. Diane from Washington. My son is in college and has gravitated to a belief in scientific materialism and won't hear any of my faith. Is there a way to help him reconsider belief in God and show him it's not irrational?
Yeah. Scientific materialism, so it's sort of this, what a lot of people today, not only do they believe it, but they consider it to be the obvious default belief. So there's this assumption that all that exists is merely material stuff, and any belief in something more than that, or below that, or above that, or beside that is just untrue. But people need to recognize that that's a theory, but why should it be the default versus anything else that's out there? Just as the materialist might say, well, anything that you point to that might be non-material, I can point to a material explanation. Well, the Eastern mystic can do the same thing with an idealistic sort of philosophy, that anything material that you point to, I can point to a merely mental explanation for that we're all just minds and there is no physical stuff. So just saying that this is obviously the default view is inadequate. You have to have reasons for it. You have to explore it. And again, one of the realities that you need to grapple with is that throughout human history, people have believed that the universe was so much more, and to some degree, every child, you start out with that assumption. You see, and in every moment of our lives, we're experiencing things that go so far beyond our ability to explain. Our own thought, the way that things can be logical, that mathematics work. Why should any of it work? Why should there be any order? Why should there be? We certainly treat morality as if it's something real. Even the most diehard relativist doesn't actually act as if their decisions are right or wrong based on just how they feel. So to treat it as simply the default and not to explore further is just, it's not honest, it's not truthful. And if you really care about truth, you might put that up there as an option, but explore more what's out there. And there are some, again, I can give you some modern authors like Peter Kreeft and Father Robert Barron and people like them to dig into. But if you really want to dig into it, you got to realize that throughout the history of the Catholic Church, some of the greatest minds in history have been wrestling with these things. You're not asking questions that haven't been asked before, even though the modern new atheists will act as if they are. Yeah. So dig, take the church on its own terms. Ask those questions and dig into its greatest minds and see what you find.
I've got a new book out, Life from Our Land, but in that book I deal with this idea, essentially, okay, we have people that only want to focus on the material. All right, well, St. Bonaventure said, let's begin there. Yep. He said, get out in nature, look at the leaves, look at the birds. As Jesus said, listen to the birds, watch the birds. Look at creation and study it, reflect on it, and then be open humbly to the message of the world, creation. Right. And Bonaventure said, you start seeing the fingerprints of God. You see His creativity. You see His love. You see the beauty of the mystery of creation, and it humbles you, draws you closer to Him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the flip side of that intellectual. That's one route, and it's an important route that I think everybody should tread in some way. But the other side of it too is, again, especially if faith is what the Church says it is. If the Church says that there's a God, and that God became man and came to meet us and remains present and accessible to us, then we can approach Him in that way and sort of test out that hypothesis. Now, you don't want to do it quickly and hastily. We're talking about a person here. but you can seek God in prayer and ask Him to make Himself known to you. Ask Him to give you that gift of faith. Again, the gift of faith does not mean believing something you don't believe, or just, doing some sort of mental yoga pose to accept a system that you don't accept. But if God is there, and He does want to know and be known by, He does know you. He wants to be known by you. Then ask Him for that. Yeah.
Another email. You kind of got going on this thing, but we'll take it a different angle. Terrence from Albuquerque says, what would be 1 or 2 books that you feel would be helpful specifically to a young adult who is discerning how to live a more authentically Catholic life? I know you're a bookophile, so you're like me, you got a gazillion books that you could think of, but are there any particular books that helped you along the way that you would want to say, yeah, listen to this author or this book that helped you grow in your Catholic life?
Yeah. Well, my big 3 on a variety of issues are Tolkien, Chesterton, and Lewis. I would recommend just about any of theirs to anyone. Aside from them, and maybe I'll go back to them a little bit. As I figured out more what the Church actually proposes in terms of faith, what the Church offers, or what the Church says I proposes that I will find if I really seek Christ. Some helpful books. What's Ralph Martin's book? The Fulfillment of All Desire. Yeah. It's a good book on, talking about this journey, this interior journey. Right. Fire Within by Dubé was a good one. And
I don't want to miss this point you said earlier, the Catechism.
Yeah, that's us. Yeah.
You really need to, as you were saying, that really, it's not a book that the Holy Father wrote for bishops. Mm-mm. It's for us all to read. Just read a page a day for the rest of your life.
Yeah. Yeah, I was so surprised to reading it, because sometimes you expect with religious materials that it's going to be dry and it's going to be didactic, and you're just going to have to get through it to get the message, But that really is a work of art. I mean, it's very beautiful language. It's written well, and people would be surprised at the wealth of knowledge, as well as scripture reference and early church fathers and other documents that are in the Catechism. That's another great one.
All right. I had a whole bunch of questions I want to run by you, but you got a good email, so I'm going to go with this one, because it has to do, I think, with even the day after Father's Day. Brianne from Omaha. As newlyweds, my husband and I are hoping to have children soon. We are concerned, though, about the ever-increasing secular culture in which the children would grow up. How can we practically foster a wholesome family environment and facilitate an authentically Catholic home?
One of my absolute favorite books on this is a small book of essays by G.K. Chesterton called What's Wrong with the World? And I'd recommend getting into Chesterton in general, because I think he does the best job of giving this vision of what Catholicism means about our life and how that plays out. But particularly in that book, he looks at the family as this primary, foundational, fundamental cell society, and he really counters this modern sense that all the important stuff happens out there, the world of commerce and business and government and the big things of the world, and that's the important, that's where life happens, and the family is sort of this extra thing. That's where you eat and you sleep, and maybe you get recharged and then you head back out. And he flips that all on its head. No, the family is where God most primarily speaks to us and reaches out to us through each other. It's in those bonds of the family. And so that's a great book that I'd recommend on giving that vision. But, God has such a plan for families, and that's the primary place where life happens, where joy happens, where the faith is learned and taught and exemplified, where children, where every human being primarily learns to love the good and beautiful and true things. And so, enjoy that with your family. Make that your biggest goal is to enjoy that domestic church with your family, and I think that's such an important thing.
Let's say you've got somebody looking out here, got 1 minute to go, and he's wondering, why should I come home to the church? What would you say?
Well, if this person is not a Christian, I'd say, seek out Christ, seek out meaning, seek out the truth, and you'll find, if you're intellectually curious, you're going to find the best of reason as well as the best of this thing we call faith in Catholicism. And to a non-Catholic Christian, to one of my brothers and sisters, we love Christ. Everything in the church, all the stuff, it's all about Christ. And everything that you've loved in Christ, you're only going to find more. He wants to offer you more. He prepared so much more for you, even in this life, and it's in Catholicism. So check it out.
JonMarc, thank you. Thanks for joining son on the program. Thank you for allowing me to invite my son to join you tonight. I hope that his expression of faith and love for Christ in his church was an encouragement to you as a husband, a father, a mother, a wife. We've got a big challenge ahead of us with our children. I hope this has been a challenge for you to give yourself totally to Christ in his church. God bless you. See you soon.